Uh, Hello, everybody, and it's great to be here. And I'd like to thank Gail very much for inviting me. And I think she's somebody who, as she's moved over to the US, she's a figure that has loomed very large in the UK bioenergy scene. I think it's somebody that we will miss. Just to briefly introduce myself, I'm a senior research fellow based at Imperial College London. But I've currently moved into a new role where I'm head of the Technical Support Unit for Working Group 3 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the panel which looks at mitigation, but essentially means that I've gone from a slightly UK-focused role to a more international one, but still looking at the options to mitigate carbon emission reductions. And the subject of this lecture is based on a section of a book that I wrote last year with Lorenzo De Lucia from Imperial and Paul Adams from the University of Bath. And the book was titled Bioenergy for Greenhouse Gas Emission Reductions. And the second part that I wrote, which kind of inspired the slightly Dr. Strangelove inspired title, was really focusing on how have we managed to tie ourselves in such policy knots, and why are some of these problems have proved so difficult that we're still struggling to address them. So what I'm proposing to do is a kind of an unashamedly broad and not very deep romp through some of the issues as I see them, which I hope will sort of set the context for the discussions that you've got this week. But also, sort of going first, I hope that Peter and Astley will be able to go into a little bit more depth on some of the issues which I bring up. So the first sort of point that I wanted to make really echoes what Gail said about the sheer sort of heady expectations that we have of bioenergy. So for the integrated assessment models, we find that sort of, bioenergy is in 10 to 50% of global primary energy demand in 2100. Most of the models suggest that constraining bioenergy supply would actually mean that mitigation was a much more expensive option. So keeping the bioenergy supply chain running is one of the ways of keeping costs low. For the Paris Agreement and the global commitments to keep temperatures to 2 degrees or lower, virtually impossible without bioenergy. Also, if you look at the pathways which are likely to get to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, so these are the RCEP representative concentration pathways 2.6 or lower. Around about 80% of those have got very large amounts of energy coming from biomass, but also biomass in combination with carbon capture and storage. So there's a significant challenge in getting anywhere close to the levels of biomass flow that will be required. Nevertheless, there is a good global industry dedicated to promoting some of these technologies, be they heat, power, biofuels, transport. And one of the things you can say about bioenergy is you can use it to produce all the sort of, typical energy services at a high standard, and those technologies already exist. So by 2015, around about 60 countries globally have got incentives in place for bioenergy or bioeconomy initiatives. So including the European Union, Russia, China, Brazil, Japan. Most of the gaps there you can see are some of the poor countries in Africa, but most of the developed countries are promoting bioenergy in some way. And if you look at what we've achieved over the last 17 years, the progress has actually been remarkably rapid. So electricity the demand has gone up by a factor of 2. Transport fuels by a factor of 7. Of what the Renewable Energy Association estimated to be 8 million renewable energy jobs globally in 2015. Around about 2.8 of those are in the kind of bioeconomy area. So in many respects, the deployment of bioenergy internationally, I think, has got to be regarded as a success. And then, of course, as Gail sort of hinted at, we end up with the backlash against it. The myriad articles that we've seen over the last, particularly, I think, 10 years, suggesting that bioenergy is not going to save us. Bioenergy is the doomsday scenario. That's essentially a cure that's worse than the disease. Some of these sort of concerns, I think, are very easy to understand. Biomass supply is inevitably intertwined and integrated with other sectors of the economy, be that agriculture, forestry, feed, food, fibre production. It's very easy to look at the deployment of biomass and bioenergy, particularly on the scale which is envisaged by, say, the IPCC AR5 report, and say this is a zero-sum game. We can't have more bioenergy unless we're having less of something else. The concern is also that, well, if we're doing this for reasons of saving carbon, well, we need to be pretty sure, given the costs, expense and effort, that actually carbon is what we're saving. And that's one of the things which has been sort of called into the question. So what I'm sort of proposing to do is sort of take a quick look at this kind of the timeline of how we got here. Starting with the 1970s oil shocks, and then looking at, I think, some of the three of the key controversies which have hit the bioenergy community over the last 10 years, and how the community has attempted to respond in terms of governance. I'm not going to go into much detail into each of the controversies, but I think that other speakers this week will be going into more detail. I'm also very conscious that a lot of the people in the room will have spent sort of years of their careers looking at some of these aspects. So there's no point in me introducing indirect land use change to the people who are very, very familiar with that. So going back to the oil shocks, so the International Energy Agency was set up in 1974, and it had a remit to look for alternative transport fuels. At the time, biofuels was identified as the option most likely to achieve early commercial success. And the interest drove purely and simply from the mandate the IEA was given of what do we do when the oil runs out? What do we do when the oil supply is constricted? How can we ramp up supplies of liquid transport fuels? And I think really from this point of time onwards, you've seen the emphasis on the liquid sort of fuel or energy vectors from biomass, and energy vectors for power, for heat, have to a certain extent sort of played sort of catch up in the policy sphere. The International Energy Agency had no interest back in the 1970s in emissions reduction. And it wasn't until 1985 that the IEA first came out with a statement which said, well, actually, energy should be carried out in an environmentally acceptable manner. 1992, the UNFCCC was set up, and climate change emerged onto the policy agenda. But still, it was in 2003 when the EU put in place its Renewable Fuels Directive to try and promote bioenergy. There was almost no consideration of the greenhouse gas emission savings benefits. So the quote that I've got here, that biofuels are very attractive, emitting between 40 and 80% less greenhouse gases than other fossil fuels. also hints at many of the other motivations for doing this. The idea that the rural economies needed to be supported, the idea that jobs needed to be would be created. At the time, large areas of land in the US and the UK, and the EU rather, had been taken out of production due to set-aside. So land concerns weren't really on the register. And it's almost 30 years after the first initiatives were put in place, and only nine years ago, we actually had a sort of legislation which actually said, well, actually, if one of the reasons we're going to start doing this is to try and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, then maybe we should have some consistent frameworks on which we do that. So the Renewable Energy Directive, introduced by the European Union in 2009, was the first, at least in Europe, piece of legislation which actually stipulated that there had to be rules for calculating the greenhouse gas impacts and minimum sustainability criteria. As I said, there's been a kind of backlash against that, and currently one of the things that we're seeing is that the next iteration of the Renewable Energy Directive is being revised. So the three sort of controversies which I wanted to touch on and just sort of flag are firstly the direct and indirect land use change, the accounting error and carbon debt debates, and I touched a little bit on the governance. And the figure here just is one of the European Environment Agency figures, which aims to illustrate quite how many other aspects of environmental policy and sectoral industrial policy, bioenergy policy interacts with. So I'm not going to explain direct and indirect land use change. I'm assuming that everybody in this audience is very well aware of all of the issues. But I did want to make a small number of points. Firstly, in the whilst the debate around indirect land use change really sort of hit the community hard in 2008 when Timothy Zurchinger published his paper on indirect land use change, there's a kind of long tradition of academic work that goes back at least until the early 1990s on this subject. And the challenges are essentially that the potential impacts of indirect land use change are of the same order of magnitude as the potential carbon savings. Now, there's been a tremendous level of debate and argument about what those impacts actually are, but the fundamental problem is that they are of a similar order of magnitude. So small changes in how you set up your supply chain for your bioenergy facility can potentially make quite a big difference. Indirect land use change can't be easily quantified or observed. As I said, the effects of the same order. Very difficult to attribute cause and effect to a single project or policy. I mean, possibly you could look at the impacts that the Drax power station has. The Drax, large coal-burning power station in the northeast of England. The supply of wood for which comes predominantly from the southeast US. You could potentially look at that project and say, well, what indirect land use change is associated with it? But even in that case, it's very difficult to do so. Very difficult to look for sort of evidence of scale and severity and attribute cause and effect. And once you have put policies in place to address indirect land use change, as the EU has done, both by amending the previous Renewable Energy Directive, but also as it envisages doing with with RED II, it's actually very difficult to monitor whether those policies are actually having the desired effect or not. There's a whole set of different modelling approaches that you can use: causal description models, equilibrium models. And I think just the diversity of modelling approaches illustrates the intractability of this problem. So after the community, or the bioenergy community, was kind of hit with indirect land use change, 3 years later, the follow-up accusation was that, well, actually, bioenergy doesn't save carbon anyway. There's an accounting error, which goes back to the way the UNFCCC is set up, such that EU directives inaccurately assess the greenhouse gas consequences of different forms of bioenergy, and that's got serious adverse consequences. This is a rather curious report from the European Environmental Agency, because if you look at the authors of the report, then there are many of the people who were responsible for the previous sort of debate around indirect land use change. And one of the key issues here is that carbon emissions at the point of combustion are measured as zero in the energy sector, which goes back to the way in which the Kyoto Protocol was implemented. So the way that it works is when biomass is harvested, it's counted as a harvested wood product, which is then reported in the forestry sector of the guidelines of the UNFCCC. And to avoid double counting, the combustion emissions are reported as zero, and any changes in carbon stocks would be reported under the agriculture, forestry, and other land use sector. The problem is that whereas the Kyoto Protocol required mandatory reporting of deforestation, afforestation, and reforestation, it didn't, in its first reporting period, the 2008 to 12, require mandatory reporting of the forestry management sector. So what that means is if the UK, which elected to report the forestry management sector, grows energy crops and burns them, and there are changes in carbon stocks, then at least in theory, those should be reported. Those changes in carbon stocks should be reported. If the UK imports bioenergy from another country which has also elected to report, then those emissions would be reported. But if the UK were to import feedstocks from a country which chose not to report in that sector, it's unlikely, but Australia chose not to report, then the UK accounts would show would show zero emissions of burning that biomass, but the Australian accounts would not show a change in carbon stock. One of the issues that I have with the kind of accounting error debate is it kind of gives the impression that an ideal alternative accounting system exists. And this is one of those moments when you're an academic where you can start to make consensus and you realise the wealth of different material that there is underneath. And there are a huge number of different accounting systems which have been postulated and how they may or may not have advantages. And overall, I think the implication that policymakers have somehow have been sort of negligent and myopic when adopting these accounting systems is incorrect. And essentially what you end up with is a prosaic accounting system which takes account, on one hand, of the ease of implementation, contrasts that with the political compromises necessary to get the accounting system agreed globally. And it also ignores the fact that these accounting systems are dynamic, so they change over time. With each subsequent round of negotiations, there are improvements. One of the latest ones is that the forest management sector, I'm not sure whether it is or will shortly become mandatory. Looking at Peter, it is mandatory. Yeah. So, as I said here, the accounting frameworks are inherently political sensitive because they relate to how countries use their resources. But the way that this kind of blow to the bioenergy community was framed, I think is it was clearly aimed to do maximum damage without considering some of the genuine challenges associated with trying to actually do better. So the third issue I wanted to touch on was carbon debt. I think, yeah. So this was the last sort of, I suppose, grand challenge which I think the bioenergy community faced, and came around or sort of hit the headlines with the 2012 publication, which was led by Greenpeace with Friends of the Earth and RSPB, which suggested that biomass was worse, or burning biomass was worse than coal. And the real issue here is when looking at forest biomass, is the timing of forest carbon stock changes is very different to the policy time frame. I realise that my slides are in a slightly different order. So there are essentially three examples of the carbon debt argument. The first is the single tree example, where a tree takes 60 years to grow, seconds to burn, then actually burning that tree doesn't do anything in the short term to reduce your carbon emissions. Whilst that might be true of a single tree, it doesn't make sense if what you're looking at is forest, and each year you're only harvesting the annual growth increment. Second example of carbon debt is where you look at the forest and say, okay, we're going to increase the harvesting intensity of the landscape. So on average, rather than harvesting a forest at 100-year rotation, you maybe go to a 60-year rotation. In that case, yes, you will get a one-off reduction in carbon stocks, but that also assumes that you do nothing to increase the productivity of the forest. And also, it is a one-off rather than a continuous sort of debt. The third type of argument around carbon debt is essentially sequestration foregone, which is the argument that the Dirty or the Coal report makes, which is essentially saying that if you have a forest which is in management, then you always have the option of stopping that management and letting that forest carry on growing and carry on sequestering carbon. That argument, I think, is somewhat misleading, partly because it discounts the fact that forest systems have episodic disturbances due to wind, fire, disease, all those other reasons which would periodically reduce carbon stocks anyway. But also, you end up in essentially a debate around the counterfactuals. So, apologies for the order of the slides, but the issue around the accounting area fundamentally comes down to the mismatch in policy timescales versus forestry management timescales. Policy timescale of 5 years is quite long. A forestry management timescale of 5 decades is quite short. So that is one of the kind of the underlying reasons for this debate, and also why it tends to devolve into a bun fight around counterfactuals rather than leading anywhere productive. So I wanted to come on to the point about governance. So most countries, or many of the countries which have introduced bioenergy incentive mechanisms, have also put in place some form of governance, which includes sustainability requirements or exclusion criteria, incentives to try and promote the lower impact sources of bioenergy rather than those which are considered at least most potentially damaging. Capacity building initiatives for third countries so that they're able to report what's going on. And all of these tend to be underpinned by certification initiatives where you're trying to take broad sustainability principles and convert these into solid decision-making criteria. But once again, a little bit like the accounting framework debate, you've got a real trade-off between the efficacy and the ease of adoption. If you put in place a system for governance which is so onerous that nobody actually takes it up, then actually you achieve nothing. And this slide is just for interest, but this is kind of one of the most complete sets of sustainability indicators from the Global Bioenergy Partnership. And as you can see in the different categories of environmental, social and economic, this is a huge range of different criteria that you might use to make a decision. So, coming to a conclusion, the challenge around governance is really caused by the scale, the complexity and diversity of the bioenergy system and how it reacts with other things, which gives it many of the kind of characteristics of a wicked problem, in that there's no simple set of solutions, and many of the elements of the potential solutions have got a large part. There's a large part they are socially determined or socially described. So, my personal views as to where we go from here. I think perhaps the greatest risk lies in paralysis, where we end up saying bioenergy is so difficult, let's just try and do something more simple instead, like PV or wind turbines. But there's also a kind of a long sort of strand in the academic literature which I take inspiration from, and that's the kind of the modelling through strand of the literature. That says, well, rather than taking an engineering approach where we try and make sure we've got the perfect decision up front, perhaps the best policy decision that we can make is the one that we can make now. And next week we may be able to make an improved decision, but what we need to do is actually start making progress and taking some steps towards implementing what, as the UNFCCC and the IPCC have already suggested, is probably one of the most important energy resources that we have in the future. Thank you very much.